This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Sarah Lancaster, K-State weed specialist, kicks off today's show as she reminds growers of the importance of controlling kochia pre-emergence. She shares tips and why it is crucial. Kansas Wildfire Awareness Week is taking place this week, so Kansas Forest Service Fire Prevention Specialist Shawna Hartman joins today's show to explain a few of the costs of wildfires. Concluding the show is K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini, who discusses the benefits of a therapeutic garden. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about kochia control with K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Always a pleasure, Shelby.
Sarah, why is kochia control something that's really important this time of year?
So one of the things about kochia is that it emerges really, really early. So it's not uncommon to see kochia in mid or even early February, depending on soil temperatures and snowfall and things of that nature. So now is the time to be on top of kochia control and to be making some of those herbicide applications for it.
What does kochia look like as it starts emerging?
So kochia can be, to the untrained eye, confused with pigweed seedlings sometimes, Palmer amaranth. It does have a little bit of a pink tinge. But the key characteristic of kochia that really affects the efficacy of post-emergence herbicides is the fact that the leaves are covered in hairs. And so I hear folks a lot of times talk about puff balls, right? They look like there's so many hairs and the leaves are pretty close together. So they just look like little puff balls in the field.
Is this something that people need to be taking care of pre-emergence, once it's emerged, or really just they'll get to it eventually?
So the time to control kochia is before it emerges. So a couple of reasons for that. One is the puff ball factor that we talked about just a second ago. The other is that we do have quite a bit of resistance to some of the products we might like to use post-emergence. So we know we have resistance to glyphosate, to some of the ALS inhibiting herbicides, even to atrazine in some cases. So really going after kochia pre-emergence is the thing to do.
What is needed for a successful management of it?
So from a herbicide perspective, we generally think about a recipe that contains at least 2 effective herbicides with differing modes of action, right? That's herbicide resistance management 101. But the other thing that we need to look at as we think about making combinations of residual herbicides is what is the availability of those herbicides going to be for uptake by that germinating seedling. So we want something that's going to take a little bit of water for activation. So dicamba is getting a lot of attention as a herbicide with that property. And then we want something that requires a little bit more water for activation. So, depending on your price point, maybe something like a pyroxasulfone containing herbicide like Zidua might be a reasonable alternative or additive there. But one of the more common recipes, Shelby, would be dicamba, atrazine, and then some flumioxazine because it's cost effective and also has some activity on kochia and does not have a lot of rotation restrictions for us.
Is this something that growers need to wait until our cold temperatures and kind of snowy conditions leave?
So we don't want to make herbicide applications when the ground is frozen. So that's pretty much every label you read is going to say, don't apply to frozen soil. But really, we want that herbicide in place before the kochia starts to germinate. So that means as soon as the ground is not frozen, probably we need to have some sort of herbicide on there if we didn't make an application in the fall, right? So a lot of folks potentially could have made this application before the ground froze in, November, October, that kind of thing. But the thing to remember there is that those fall applications may or may not get us all the way through to our first planned spring application, depending on when you want that to be, right? The joke is that the best answer from an agronomist is it depends. There's a lot of factors that it depends on there.
Is this something they need to take care of for all crop fields?
Yeah, so, kochia does emerge early, but it is a problem in pretty much all of our crops that we can grow in western Kansas. Not as problematic as things like palmer amaranth, but if you've got it, it is a problem. So yeah, we need to think about it across the board from our fields going to corn and grain sorghum to if folks are planting cotton or even soybeans, things of that nature, we need to have that on our radar.
And these kochia control articles are part of an e-update kind of series. And last week, you wrote one specifically looking at corn and grain sorghum and what specifically for that when it comes to kochia control.
We're going to maybe have made that fall application. And now we're going to start thinking about what are we going to put down to prepare ourselves for corn season. And there was some good work done out of Hayes that they were looking at just different herbicide combinations that could go ahead of corn or grain sorghum. And really some of the more effective treatments were all, 2-pass treatments, right? So you've got kind of an early pre-plant that would be kind of Marchish, and then you're immediately before planting or right at planting type of treatment. And, up to as much as the data was collected 13 weeks after treatment, some of the top performing treatments included products like Outlook or dimethenamide P is the active ingredient there, and Sharpen, saflufenicil would be the active ingredient there. So the premix of that is Verdict. So that's, that combination of a PPO inhibiting herbicide, which is the Sharpen, followed by or in addition to a group 15 herbicide. So that would be the Outlook, or we mentioned Zidua a little bit ago. So, that's a pretty common recipe for a lot of different programs. And it addresses the issues of, potential triazine resistance and things of that nature. The caveat there, Shelby, that we've talked about quite a bit on the extension circuit the last couple of years is that our colleagues to the north have got very widespread PPO resistant kochia. So they see both pre and post-emergence resistance to things like flumioxazin or our Valor types of products, as well as sulfentrazone. So the Spartan types of products or the Authority line of products, and also post-emergence resistance to Sharpen or saflufenicil. So we don't want to rely solely on those PPO inhibitors, and that's where, that combination of at least 2 effective herbicides is really important.
And an article that will be coming out today on eUpdate talks about soybeans, sunflower, cotton, and wheat. And anything specific to share for those crops?
Yeah, so the options really are a little more limited for those crops, Shelby, especially, you mentioned sunflower, right? Pretty much sulfentrazone is what we have for that situation. But sulfentrazone is a good product for us right now. And so there's been some data collected again out of Hayes. And, some of those top products were things like Valor plus Zidua. So in soybeans, that would be Fierce is the brand name of that premix. But Spartan performs well. Spartan or sulfentrazone with dicamba performs well as also. So a little fewer options. Need to think a little more carefully about, that crop rotation there. But we can still have some effective programs ahead of those broadleaf crops.
What are the key things that people and growers really need to look at when they're planning what they're going to do with kochia control?
The key is timeliness and getting some herbicides down before that kochia starts to germinate, certainly before it starts to emerge. And then, again, that multiple effective herbicides. So probably something like a PPO inhibiting herbicide, right? We've talked about those a lot. Other products that can be effective in front of corn in particular would be things like Balance or Scoparia, those isoxafludel-containing herbicides.
That was K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. I will link the e-update articles discussing kochia control in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can find them for yourself by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Clemson University Extension's Adam Krinkovich.
Livestock producers, you perhaps already know just how complicated your tax consideration can be.
Sometimes things get very specific based on even what sector of agriculture you are in.
So as Clemson University Extension's Adam Kantrovich says, while farm operators have items like purchases for resale and capital assets to consider within taxes, things can be more complicated for livestock producers. Say, beef, cow, calf growers, raising animals as feeders, purchasing producing more livestock for future feeding and eventual sale.
These begin to create a significant amount of complications as it relates to record keeping and then dealing with the tax implications as something similar to that.
So from a tax perspective, a breeder animal versus an animal to be sold.
If I purchase an animal and I intend to breed that animal is now considered a capital asset. Therefore, it must be tracked in a certain manner through our accounting and for tax purposes. If I purchase an animal, but my intentions are to raise that animal, feed the animal, and turn around and sell it later, it has to be tracked differently within my records and my accounting. And there are different tax implications for that one animal.
And that's what Katrovich calls a simple example of tax implications for a livestock operation. Something more complicated?
What happens if I am breeding animals and then the offspring of those animals are now raised on my property? My intentions of how I'm going to utilize those animals and those intentions may change. How do I handle that animal from a record-keeping standpoint, an accounting standpoint? And then the tax treatment may be very well different when I sell that animal, simply because of its original intent and or the change of intention while I'm holding that animal as inventory.
Then add complication on top of complication. Matters such as depreciation of capital assets, which will vary from farm to farm, and a producer's individual choices.
Some of the tax management strategies that we may have as farms may be similar to non-farm businesses, but we also have some that are pretty specific to farming and commercial fishing.
And Katrovich notes, since some of these specific tax strategies are underutilized by producers, some tax professionals may not understand them, and therefore implement them as part of tax considerations. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Thursday show talking about Kansas Wildfire Awareness Week with fire prevention specialist with the Kansas Forest Service, Shawna Hartman. Shawna, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me today, Shelby.
Shawna, Kansas Wildfire Awareness Week, something really just specific to Kansas and not other places, and why is that?
Yeah, so there's a National Wildfire Awareness Month in May, and as we know here in Kansas, by May, at least we're hopeful that there will be green up and we'll have a reduced amount of wildfires. So in February, the governor signs a proclamation each year to designate a week in February prior to, again, we hope, prior to wildfire season so that people can prepare and be aware of the potential for the wildfire risks that are to come.
As this is Kansas Wildfire Awareness Week, wanting to take the time to recognize it and remind people of a few things around wildfires. And as we do that, is there almost a theme for how Kansas Forest Service has recognized this week?
We had a theme. We have our partners also with Kansas Division of Emergency Management and the Office of the State Fire Marshal. We came up with a theme, and it's the cost of wildfire is too high to ignore. And it comes at a really good time with what we're seeing out in California and the risks that could happen here and the costs and impacts here in Kansas.
And as we have seen some devastation from California, any concern of our replication of that being in Kansas?
So here in Kansas, we have the fuels that are similar to what they see in Southern California. We've got the wind. So what we don't have is the condensed number of people and homes in one area. So at the scale that we saw in California, probably not likely that we'll see it here in Kansas. But at a much smaller scale, but just as devastating, yeah, we could definitely see that here.
And when we're thinking about wildfire, important to note our fire departments, volunteer and full-time ones as well.
Yeah, one of the impacts and costs when we talk about the cost of wildfire, it's not just monetary costs, but we're also talking about impacts. And one of the impacts that we really wanted to highlight this year with Wildfire Awareness Week was the emotional and physical stress that we have on our fire departments and our firefighters. So over 85% of our rural fire departments are volunteer. And so when we think about our wildfires here in Kansas, and that we respond to over 5,000 wildfires in a season, and our season can be 2 months, it can be 4 months, spread out all over the whole year. We can have wildfires every month out of the year. We're taking firefighters away from their jobs and out of their homes, and to fight these fires. And sometimes they go for just a few hours, and sometimes they go for a few days. And that's your neighbors. And so when you're thinking of these activities that could spark a wildfire on these high-risk days, we just ask you to be aware of the impact that could have if it gets away from you.
Another really big thing that wildfires can have an impact on: livestock.
Livestock and people's livelihoods. We've seen in these large fires that we've had around Kansas is our landscape is made up of a lot of farming and ranching communities, and that's our livelihood. And when a wildfire rips through your pasture land and your farmland, that's your livelihood, and that's also livestock. We've seen mortality of livestock as well, and that's not only an impact, but it also is an economic impact as well, not only just to that family and that farming community, but it resonates with the whole state as well.
And also an impact to those rural communities.
Yeah, the impact to those rural communities is devastating, because you're usually not talking about one farmer and rancher. You're talking about multiple, and that's what keeps those rural communities going, is those multiple farmsteads, and so it does make a huge impact on those rural communities.
And another thing that wildfires usually, unfortunately, take out homes, and what impact can that really have?
Well, that's another emotional impact to people who lose their refuge, their home, their memories, and you can rebuild, and we want you to remember that we can rebuild homes. We don't want you to stay in your homes if a fire is coming, but that is a huge impact. It's just emotional, and it's not only a loss for you, but the impact it has for the firefighters that we're trying to save that home too. It has a toll. It takes a toll on them as well.
And as we're taking the time to recognize Wildfire Awareness Week here in Kansas, what are some things that you really want people just to know about if they're starting to hear about wildfires, maybe in their area? Yeah,
so some things that we can do in Kansas to, first of all, prevent wildfires is we're a wildfire state. We love to use fire. We're fire adapted. And so it's great to use prescribed burns and to use brush piles. And so some things that we can do to make sure that our brush piles don't rekindle and get away on those days that are windy after you think that they're out, or your prescribed burn. It's one of the number one reasons for our wildfires across Kansas is rekindled intentional burns. And so going back and checking and rechecking, stirring up your brush piles, checking your prescribed burns, those are one way that we can definitely prevent some of our wildfires from happening. And then you can start preparing your home as well. So we, at Kansas Forest Service, so it's kansasforest.org, there's a tool that we have. It's called WRAP. It's Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal. And you can go on there, type in your address, and it will tell you what your risk is. You can print off a report or look at a report there on your computer that tells you exactly what you can do to make your home a little bit more hardened to the risks of wildfire.
And Shawna, what about for if there is a wildfire coming, what do people need to have collected or put in a safe location?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have a guide that's called the Wildfire action plan on Kansas Forest Service website again, and it goes through those documents that you should have, know where they're located, usually when you get your computer and your safe box and any of those documents, pictures that you want to get, know where those are located now, and kind of have a list of what you would grab if you had an hour, if you had 30 minutes, if you had 10 minutes, if you had 5 minutes. What would you do? What would you grab? If it's medical records, if it's medicine, if it's your pets, if it's just make sure. And then always, just like if you're having a house fire, where to meet. It's always good, of course, off location of where you would meet up again with your family if you had to leave at different times and go out different directions, or worst case scenario, kind of think that through and make sure that you have a plan.
As we think about this year's Kansas Wildfire Awareness Week, what are the key points you really like our Kansas farmers and ranchers to keep in mind as we enter the unfortunate wildfire season?
Yeah, just remember that we're going to have dry, windy days. We have those fuels that even though we have snow on the ground now or may have again, there's going to be those days that it's going to be dry, windy, and our grasses are going to dry out. And there's going to be the spark. So when you're welding, when you're mowing your lawn, when you're brush hogging, any of those things that could produce a spark, chains on your trailer, any of those things that could produce a spark on those windy days, just be aware. Maybe postpone those for a day until the wind dies down, the humidity comes up, or have a plan in place if a fire starts and know what to do and how to quickly put that out.
Shawna, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
That was fire prevention specialist with the Kansas Forest Service, Shawna Hartman, as she was discussing Kansas Wildfire Awareness Week. If you'd like to learn more information from the Kansas Forest Service, I recommend you take the time to check out their website, kansasforest.org. Again, that is kansasforest.org. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. I will also link the specific resources that she mentioned in today's show. One of those was WRAP, the Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal. WRAP can be used by homeowners and landowners, or also be used by emergency managers and firefighters. You can find that for yourself by going to kansasforest.org, clicking on Fire Management on the left-hand column, and then selecting WRAP. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you after the break.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini recently presented a webinar to the North Central Region Aging Network on therapeutic gardens. In addition to covering the research-based benefits of gardening, she also discussed how to set up a therapeutic garden, which she says is an accessible garden.
And an accessible garden is one that's designed to allow people of all ages and abilities to enjoy and participate in their gardening experience. And maybe you're familiar with the term universal design. That term is not specific to gardening, but it's commonly used when people are designing an accessible garden. Universal design is not a targeted approach specific to individuals with disabilities or differently abled, but it's an environment that's created to allow everyone to benefit and everyone to enjoy that space. It's universal. Accessible gardening is important because it makes the garden safe. Everyone's able to participate. Everyone's able to have success in the garden, which is so important for therapeutic purposes, especially. Participants are able to feel like they belong and they're able to enjoy their time in the garden rather than focusing on How am I going to adapt this space to make it so I can come and participate? How am I going to make it to that garden way out there when it's hot outside? Those kinds of decisions are stressful. So an accessible garden takes away the stress of the participant having to make adaptations. The garden's already adapted to meet their needs. There are many ways to create an accessible garden for any population. So as I already mentioned, this does not need to be a traditional in-ground garden. Container gardening is a great way to accommodate many different needs. For example, people who aren't able to visit an outdoor garden, smaller containers can be moved indoors during gardening sessions to bring the garden to them. Containers can be grown under a cover to provide shade, but also protection from weather, making it so the space is more accessible. Containers can be brought up to a table space so participants can garden while sitting down or even garden while standing rather than having to be bent over. And one of the great benefits of gardening in containers is the maintenance is very low, much lower than a traditional in-ground garden. Vertical gardening is another creative way to make gardening more accessible. One of the more well-known, probably, vertical garden styles is using a trellis and allowing plants to climb up the sides and even the top of the trellis sometimes. Vertical gardening is a great option because it makes a really beautiful display, but it also can be supported in a way that gardeners can sit while maintaining the space side by side with someone who's standing while they're gardening. And again, that brings that social connection and makes the space more accessible. Raised beds are a common accessible gardening feature you're probably familiar with. Just like with container gardens, there are plenty of options in what types of materials can be used to create a raised bed. They could be purchased and can be designed to accommodate seated gardeners or standing gardeners. The raised bed dimensions are something you want to consider to make the space accessible. They should allow the gardener to easily access the plants in the center of the bed. So the width should be no more than 4 feet across if there is access all the way around the planter. Easy access raised beds are 3 feet or more in height. A standing gardener does not have to stoop over to garden in that height, and the work surface is no lower than their fingertips. For seated gardeners who want to use a raised bed space, they tend to be about 2 feet high, and you'll want a space for them to pull up underneath the raised bed.
That's Cynthia Domenghini, a K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist with information on setting up a therapeutic garden. To learn more about the physical and mental health benefits of gardening, contact your local county or district extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.